Now for the next panel. Our panel is titled Setting the Scenes. It will explore the insights from 25 years of research, policies and practices on multilingualism and linguistic diversity. For the moderator and speakers, may I ask that you join the stage via the middle staircase, please? So I invite Shannon Bischoff, Director of Three Rivers Language Centre at Purdue University, as moderator to come to the stage, as well as the speakers Michael Connolly, Bodiel Fall, Joseph J. Murray, and Claude Sevenig. Thank you.
Great. All right. Bonjour. Hello, everyone. In the spirit of being concise and staying on time, we'll get started. I want to thank everyone for being here today and thank the panel for traveling to join us. Today we have Mr. Michael Connolly joining us. He's the Global Director of English and School Education with the British Council. We have Bodiel Fall, the coordinator of the ELON program, or School and National Languages, at the Institute of Francophonie for Education and Training. We have Mr. Joseph Murray, President of the World Federation of the Deaf and Secretary General of International Disability Alliance. Finally, we have Ms. Claude Sevenig, the Education Advisor at the Permanent Representation of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Thank you for joining us, panel. The way the session will run is that the panelists will be asked one question, and we'll have about 8 minutes to answer. So panelists, I'm going to be watching you carefully. Just kidding. And then we'll have a second round. We will ask them for some advice and guidance, and I'll have about 1 minute on that. And then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. And I encourage all of you to please engage our panelists. I've been asked to say a few words about the past 25 years and internationally what has been happening in terms of multilingualism. While there is much work to be done, and much of what I will mention might be controversial in some arenas, it has been a quite successful 25 years. When we think about nation states, many nation states have adopted multiple languages as their official languages, which is a shift from the early 20th and mid-20th century. For example, Taiwan now has 16 official languages, Zimbabwe, 16 languages. Japan, oddly, has finally recognized the Ainu as a distinct group, not only culturally, but linguistically. Bolivia has 36 official languages, Ecuador, 23. The state of Alaska in the United States, my home country, has 20 indigenous languages as their official languages. Guatemala has 23 languages. In the United States, where we've had a very long history of monolingualism ideologies and Americanization through English, a grassroots movement by the American people has led to what we call the Seal of Biliteracy, which is in 50 states now officially. And there are over 145 languages recognized. This means that our high school graduates, our students in the United States, can be recognized for their multilingual abilities. In addition to that, since 1980, the United States every 2 years has increased its multilingual youth by 5%. So today, about 25% of the youth in the United States are multilingual. That's quite remarkable. And these are naturally born citizens, which shows that the culture in the United States has shifted at the grassroots level, in that multilingualism is becoming a norm in the country, which is very exciting for people like myself. We have seen since 2000, there were 745 bachelor programs in Europe in the English language. Today, there are over 4,000. Korea is discussing becoming a bilingual nation as well, with English as a potential language. In the academy, where I spend most of my life, Multilingualism, translanguaging, and code switching have become independent fields of their own, with a growing body of research and study behind them showing the benefits of these forms of communication. Also, when I was much younger, the ideal speaker for theory was a monolingual speaker. Today in the academy, monolingualism is accepted as the norm. We recognize that the majority of people are multilingual. Again, in my home country, it is now possible in the Kingdom of Hawaii or the state of Hawaii to actually get a PhD in the Hawaiian language. These are all incredible changes that we've seen in the last 25 years that were not imaginable in the 1980s and the 1990s. So congratulations to UNESCO and the United Nations and all of you for your wonderful efforts. There are lots of fruits to this work, but much to be done. With that in mind, I will start with Mr. Michael Conley, who has been working on, as the Global Director of English and School Education. Mr. Conley, you've witnessed the British Council works in over 100 countries around the world, promoting peace, prosperity, to build connections, understanding, and trust between people in the UK and countries worldwide. Last year, the British Council celebrated its 90th anniversary. Congratulations. And supporting English language education within the context of multilingualism has long been at the heart of your work. From the British Council's perspective, what does a healthy, just, fair language and education ecosystem look like? And what role will English play in the multilingual world of the future?
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you. Can you hear
Great.
me? Thank you very much, Shannon. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. And Gia Ditch. For those of you who don't know, Gia Ditch is an Irish greeting, and that's the country that I come from. So I'm really delighted to be here today. It's always great to be working with UNESCO. The British Council and UNESCO have collaborated since the foundation of UNESCO in 1945, and we've been part of that journey ever since. So at the British Council, as Shannon mentioned, we work in approximately 100 countries around the world, and in about 50 of those countries, we support national and state governments with English language teaching and learning. We also engage with about 6 million English language teachers around the world, both through online and face-to-face professional development programs. 1 million teachers in India, and I think 2 in the Vatican City. So we have teachers engaging with us in every country in the world. The majority of the work we do is where English is taught as a subject, as an additional language. But increasingly, we're seeing English being introduced earlier and earlier into school curriculums. In Africa and South Asia in particular, English medium education is our major focus, where English medium education in the basic education system. We're also seeing a massive increase in English medium education in higher education. In somewhere like the European Union, there's been a massive increase in the number of MAs which are in the English language. And we see in countries such as China, in every single higher education institute in China now has an English medium aspect to it. This is often quite problematic. It was mentioned earlier that 37% of young children in low and middle income countries are learning in a language which they don't understand. In Africa, up to 80% are learning in a language which is not the most familiar language to them, whether that be English or French or Portuguese. And there are multiple reasons for this, which we all know about: social and economic capital, English as a global lingua franca, and the legacy of colonial education systems, employability, internationalization of higher education. So it's obvious, I hope, to everyone in this room at least, that language is the key to equitable, inclusive education systems. Language is the way we convey information and knowledge, and so it's basically the cornerstone of learning. And it's also, I think, obvious to most of us that if you're learning in a language which you don't understand or teaching in a language which you don't really speak, you aren't going to learn that language and you aren't going to learn anything else. And this is particularly problematic. So acknowledging that is a really big first step. And the work of UNESCO, the UN, the World Bank, and organizations around the world over the last 20 years has had considerable impact on acknowledging that. So what is a healthy system? It's balanced and multi-layered. It's contextually situated, looking at the socio-linguistic makeup of a country or a context. It allows educators and learners to develop and utilize their full linguistic repertoires. At the same time, we need to be realistic. It needs to reflect and acknowledge the needs and realities and aspirations of individuals and governments and countries. We need to think about the history, the politics, the geopolitics, and of course, the economic factors in language policies. There needs to be space for multiple languages. That could be the home language, a local or state language, national languages, and international languages, such as English. We need learners to be prepared for a globalized, or perhaps more accurately, a globalized world of the future. They need skills to communicate in intercultural settings, both within their own regions and globally. So getting the balance right in language and education policies, thinking about all these factors that I've mentioned, is incredibly complex. And in many countries of the world, that complexity is not acknowledged and not factored in the development of language and education policy. As the British Council, we do believe that English as a shared international language can be a positive thing, creating opportunities in education, in employment, personally, for communities, for countries. It enables exchange and collaboration if it is integrated well into the education system. But frequently it's not. It's driven by political needs, often demand from below, which equals votes, which equals politics. And it's also perceived benefits of economic development through English, which are sometimes real and sometimes perceived, but not real. It's not frequently not integrated well into the system. There's lack of support for teachers. Teachers frequently don't have the language proficiency that they need, and they don't have the pedagogical approaches that they need to work in a multilingual classroom. So English can be a language which enables and empowers, but it can also be a language that can dominate an education system and can dominate and can exacerbate inequalities and being a gatekeeper to education and employment opportunities. So I think it's good to acknowledge the successes, which Shannon did earlier. There are many good examples of changes in language and education policy from India, Nepal, South Africa, and across Europe. However, challenges remain both in the implementation of these policies as well as the development in some contexts. So just to conclude, we believe, and I think with good reason, that English will continue to play a very significant role in education. And that reflects the reality that English plays in other domains, the language of international business, academia, science, technology. English is globally used and will continue to be globally used for the foreseeable future. But it's important to note it doesn't belong to us, it doesn't belong to the UK, it doesn't belong to the British Council. English now belongs to the world. It is a truly global language and it belongs to the people who speak it and use it. Thank you very much.
Michael. It's a wonderful sentiment that English belongs to the speakers in the world. Thank you. Now we're going to turn to Ms. Budel-Fall. With nearly 15 years of experience in bilingual and multilingual education, now coordinating the School of National Languages program, you can see that the promotion of multilingual education is one of the priorities of Francophonie. Could you please share with us your observations on the concrete progress implemented in the countries in relation to research and international recognitions on this very specific issue?
Thank you, Shannon. Merci. Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you to UNESCO for this invitation. The International Francophonie Organization is delighted to cooperate with this organization and has done for many years on common issues, particularly the issues we're discussing today. First of all, just to give you an idea of what Francophonie is, for those who are not familiar, the International Organization for Francophonie, based here in Paris, has a specialized institute for education and training based in Dakar, Senegal, and it works with the 93 member states of the IOF on 5 overall issues: teacher training, vocational training of young people, gender equality, and then bi and multilingual education, which is what we're discussing today. Now, to come back to your question, Shannon, as regards the state of play and what research is, where research is, as the previous speaker said, is that what we see in the educational system is that there are learning difficulties. There is a poor reading and writing skills, mathematics, and so on, that it's unsatisfactory. And we see the language of teaching in sub-Saharan Africa, which is French, in my case, and it's very often the only language, and yet there is informal, non-formal speaking of national languages by pupils. So there's a link here between the language of instruction and the poor level of skills on the other side, because there's a lack of familiarity with the language of instruction, which is French. So 8 out of 10 French children in these countries don't understand the language of instruction. Now, research in respect of cognition and psychology shows that using the language used by the child in school allows them to verbalize their thinking and develop learning skills and learn more quickly and more efficiently other languages and other subjects. That is why our organization for several years has been working to support countries in developing reforms, incorporating in the educational system the question of bilingualism, that is concomitant development of the mother tongue and French. And that is why we've established the ELAN program in French school and national languages, which aims to improve the quality of learning through bilingualism. And in this program, which has been in place since 2012, we have a systemic approach to bilingualism, a multidimensional process in terms of institutions, teacher training, and pedagogical and didactic resources, advocacy for the use of national languages, and in thinking in terms of a continuum. So there's no break in the cycle. In other words, so people can use the languages for themselves and to develop their pupil skills. Now, I'll skip what we've done in the various countries in terms of producing teaching resources for the teachers themselves, but also for the students. We've also developed modules for training of teachers, for initial training, so that they can hold bilingual classes. And what we've seen after some 15 years of experience is that the real issue now is perpetuating this. How can we go beyond the pilot phase? Because there are several experiments which have been tried out in the countries in which we intervene. How can we then scale it up and make these reforms sustainable? And we've seen certain states who have several years of experience beginning to develop a strategic vision, a national vision regarding what bilingual reform may comprise. In other words, they project their vision of bilingualism with sustainability and feasibility financially and operationally. And I can give two examples here. We have Burkina Faso, which for several years now is pursuing this drive, and it's culminated in the adoption of an educational language policy incorporating bilingualism for 2021 to 2030. And it's also adopted a harmonized formula for bilingual education, consolidating all of these processes, conveying a vision of the country and a reference framework adopted by decree last year, 2024. They've also adopted a financial simulation model, which was the upshot of work between the National Education Ministry, the International Institute for Educational Planning of UNESCO, and ourselves. And it was also adopted by the authorities. And what's noteworthy here is that this system allows pupils to complete primary schooling in 5 years instead of 6 years, as was the case under the single language system before. So it's, in economic and teaching terms, a step forward. And then in Senegal, a similar sort of drive. Senegal has also adopted what it calls a harmonized model for bilingual education, which has been put into place since the start of the current school year in 9 parts of Senegal, 9 regions. And to conclude, I would say that today what we're seeing is a realization, a clear realization amongst international partners and national partners in the countries, the examples I've given, a realization of this key issue of multilingualism in schools and the role to be played by national languages in improving the quality of education and learning. And the ultimate issue of why you should use a national language, why have bilingualism? Well, we've gone beyond that. We're all aware that all the studies show and the various assessments show that there is a real asset in using national languages amongst the kids in school. The question is how? How do we bring about an educational bilingual reform which is fully fledged and go beyond just the pilot project phase and have a systemic approach to incorporate it instead? Thank you.
Thank you, Bodil. Next, we will turn to Mr. Joseph Murray. As the president of the World Federation of Deaf, can you discuss the significance of International Mother Language Day for deaf communities and the importance of national sign languages in multilingual education settings?
Thank you. I'm going to start by teaching you 2 signs in my mother language, which is American Sign Language. Good morning. Good morning. So contact me after if you want to learn a few more signs. You're welcome. I'm very honored to be here today to celebrate Mother Language Day. And it's a very important day for the deaf community throughout the world. It's definitely the definition of encouraging and promoting multi-language use. The mother tongue of people, of deaf children, and hearing children that grow up in families that use sign language. And there are many, many people that use sign language around the world. We have 70 million deaf people, and we're working with many, many sign language users across the globe. Our vision is a world where deaf people everywhere can sign anywhere. And that vision, to achieve that, we want to disseminate sign language, spread sign language as part of national languages of each country and society. Languages should be promoted, diversified, and you can all sign in your country's sign language. I would say that sign languages are full language. It's not a communication tool, it's a full language with its own grammar, syntax, equal to any spoken language. But to understanding of sign language is very far behind. We're still struggling for people to understand the importance of sign language in education. Deaf children first got sign language in the 1700s, the 1800s. And then in 1880, one country forced a resolution banning the use of sign language in many countries around the world. This resolution lasted for many, many years. Deaf children were missing out. And we were working with UNESCO to try and permanently record that as history in the UNESCO Memory of the World program. And it's important that we see this resolution for what it was, the ideology behind not allowing deaf children to use their own language. And moving on, anywhere in the world where there are deaf people, you have a sign language. This shows the resilience of the deaf community to actually fight, to continue to use their own sign languages. And inclusive education in the deaf community, we must have a multilingual education in the sign language of the country and in the written and spoken language of that country in parallel. And still today, we have a basic access to education. Sometimes I think we're going back 200 years. Children are still lacking basic access to be taught in their country's sign language. Deaf children are many times put into schools with no environment of sign language users. They have no access to sign language models, teachers, aides, and so on. In the World Federation of the Deaf, we are working to be fully members of the Convention of Sign Language. And we must make that very clear. We must support the right of every deaf child to be educated in a language where the society promotes and supports their language use. A bilingual education system. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we've released a position paper of the right to sign language for families of deaf children, because 99% almost are born to families where the parents do not know sign language, the families don't know it. And it's important that families of a deaf child learn sign language and have free access to be educated about the sign language and in the sign language of their country. Each deaf child has the right to say, "I love you," to their parents. Every parent has the right to say, "I love you," back to your children. And when sign languages are there, we're promoting the announcement of 10 fundamental principles which will strengthen the rights of deaf children to access their language and those of their families. And we must have that as a bilingual approach, at least. Today, we see the impulse of language deprivation. Children in an environment with no language, no sign language, no access to the spoken language of that country have very little access to language, and they are deprived of language. And they're deprived of a fundamental human right. And deaf children should be aware of their rights of sign language. So please, click on the cue card and take this declaration with you. Support them to help us to achieve the change in national governments, to recognize and promote the different sign languages of that country. Today, we have 80 countries which have officially recognized their country's sign language. And there are over 100 that haven't recognized officially their country's sign language. So please work with us. Please come, talk to me, approach me. Let's see how we can work together so that each of your countries have children who can access sign language as part of their learning and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Now we'll move on to Ms. Claude Sevenik. Luxembourg is a multilingual country with 3 official languages, Luxembourgish, French and German. Luxembourg has a lot of experience in implementing multilingual education policies. As a student, I had to read a lot about this, though I don't know anything. Seeking to combine the learning of languages important to the country with the learning of mother tongues. In 2017, Luxembourg implemented a multilingual education program for young children, and you are currently preparing a reform that will consist of offering students the choice of being taught literacy, learning to read and write in French or German. Can you describe the reasons that led your government to propose these reforms, describing the evolution of language learning policies to ensure inclusive and quality education, and to guarantee that every child acquires the language skills that are so essential for all learning?
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for welcoming me and for organizing these days on mother language and multilingualism and linguistic diversity. Given the very special situation of Luxembourg, as you reminded us, these are issues which we are continually dealing with in a very intensive way, and I'm very honored to be able to share our experience with you today. And I'll briefly give you the context as far as the languages in the country are concerned before explaining and describing language learning in Luxembourg and the challenges this poses. As you recall, there are 3 official languages, Luxembourgish, French and German in Luxembourg, and Luxembourgish is our national language. It's spoken in Luxembourg families, and it was only promoted as national language in 1984. Now, 50% of the population are speaking a multitude of other languages all the time, everywhere. A lot of English, of course, Portuguese, Italian, also Slav and Nordic languages. These are expatriate communities that are quite substantial in Luxembourg. And in our country, we are encountering this language diversity all day, everywhere, whether it's in the daily life of people, in the schools, the media. Our newspapers, for example, are bilingual or trilingual. You'll see an article in German or French alongside one in Luxembourgish. And recently, more and more often, you're seeing news in English. So just to explain things better, unlike Switzerland, where language diversity is regional, in our country, the languages are present all day, right across the country in every situation. So we very often see people moving from one language to another, and it's perfectly normal in our day-to-day lives. We switch language depending on the context or the person we're talking to. And we, if possible, of course, adapt to the language they speak. So our school system is also trilingual, and it's very demanding when it comes to language learning. Luxembourgish remains the language of communication and integration, and its learning is very much encouraged from early childhood. And traditionally in our schools, children learn to read and write in German, and German still remains the language of teaching in primary and secondary schools, and that is changing as of the 2nd or 3rd year of secondary school. French kicks in, but there are also some exceptions. But I won't go into the details today. French is learned as the second language from primary school, but not as a foreign language. It becomes a language of instruction later, and English tends to be learned from the second year of secondary school. And I'd like to stress here what this means for virtually all pupils in Luxembourg schools. Learning in all subjects is mostly in a language which is not the language we speak at home or our mother tongue, which means that most students draft their exam papers in a language which is not their first language, and you can imagine what an effort that is. So the subject has to be assimilated. People need to know what they're talking about, but you also need a sufficient level of mastery of the language, proficiency of the language, to be able to be concise and precise in expressing ideas. And this is true for all pupils, including the students in Luxembourg. So that's the language situation for our overall population. And its diversity, of course, is reflected as well in our schools. According to the figures for the 2023-2024, the school year, only some 33% had Luxembourgish as the language spoken at home. I'd also like to stress a specificity. 2/3 of those who don't speak Luxembourgish at home learn a Latin language, and then the last third speak multiple languages, any language you like. And we have classes where there are more languages spoken than pupils. So we're talking about a situation which we call linguistic hyperdiversity. So our school system allows us to learn 3 or 4 languages, but it nonetheless poses challenges, and they've already been mentioned here. Of course, there are major advantages for children who rapidly learn to read and write and gain proficiency, but there are also challenges for those that don't have that good fortune. Very often children who have no contact with German or Luxembourgish at home. And if on top of that, those children come from disadvantaged backgrounds, then their opportunities are much poorer compared to international students. And recent analysis has clearly demonstrated this. So we can't remain idle given this situation. And we've been making efforts for a long time to get children to learn Luxembourgish from early childhood, but they've not been that successful. And ever since 2013, we've really got to grips with this challenge. And our government is now working hard to adapt our school system to this huge diversity. So there are 3 main pillars in what we do. Childhood, diversification of the offer in school, and literacy. Now we've had a multilingual education program for early childhood to make the most of that period of intense learning, stressing first and foremost the development of language skills and quality and communication and interaction. It also promotes contact of children with the future languages of learning, that is French and Luxembourgish. And of course, it's a playful approach, recreational, adapted to early childhood. It's not language teaching per se, but getting them in touch with and becoming familiar with languages they'll be working later. It's for children from 1 to 4, and it's rolled out in all early childhood structures that benefit from state funding. At the same time, since 2016, we also have diversified offer of education, which is accessible to all and free of charge, with 6 European schools, which propose the European program leading up to the European Baccalaureate, as well as school offering English curricula, and also an international baccalaureate offer. So these are schools which are much more flexible in what they offer children, and the children can choose their language of teaching, whether it's the mother tongue or languages much closer to what they hear in their personal environments and families. And I'd like to conclude by coming back to our Alpha program, which is the possibility of becoming literate in French, because we want to develop an alternative offer in traditional state schools. And in 2022, we launched a pilot project for literacy in French, and the families will have a choice between two solutions. It's their decision on the basis of the recommendations in nursery schools who are familiar with the linguistic biography of the children and their environments and the languages spoken in their families and amongst their nearest and dearest. So it's been very important for us to ensure there's been cohesion and not have two parallel tracks. So the children stay in the same group. It's just that they are separated for the literacy lessons and for maths at the start, and then in other subjects they study them together. So the role of the school remains unchanged, and the trilingualism I mentioned earlier will stay, and it's not being called into question. So in the third year now of this pilot project, which is closely being tracked by scientific institutes, and we are fairly optimistic regarding achieving our objectives. And the first inputs have been very positive, particularly in terms of the effects on the well-being and motivation of children and the skills they now have in being able to follow classes, and they don't tend to drop out, so to speak. So in optimistic terms, I'd like to conclude, and thank you for your attention.
All right. I will refrain. There's much to say about what has been discussed, but we want to respect time, so we'll move forward. No. You're fine. We're doing great. And now we'll go to what the organizers refer to as the lightning round. I find that an interesting title because we could spend the entire afternoon, I think, in this next section, which is to hear some recommendations from our panelists. So I'm going to ask each panelist to share in 1 minute 2 key recommendations that, in your opinion, will be the most important actions to take forward in the next years to promote multilingualism in all forms of languages. And we're going to go in reverse this time. So, Ms. Semenik, you get to go again. So if you'll please share with us perhaps 2 recommendations that might promote multilingualism in all forms of languages. And you have 1 minute.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I will try to be fast on this one. Now, the first point, this may be a recommendation in support of multilingualism, but it's more than anything a recommendation to support the learning of languages by children. The development of young children must be considered as a major priority. And Madam said it as well, a first language that is rich, that is consolidated, is indispensable for any further learning at a later stage. You need to know how to call things, concepts and actions, to put names on them. Otherwise, you cannot learn the subjects. You cannot structure your thought, your reflection. You need words to be able to think. And I think as adults, we are all here, parents or grandparents or support teachers, educators. We must not be tempted by the screens and other objects that have invaded our lives and that have a strong attraction power for our attention. We must first and foremost pay attention to our children, and especially the young children who are learning to read, who are learning to speak and to develop their language skills. Now, I also briefly described the linguistic situation in Luxembourg, which is different from any other, and I don't think there are two similar contexts anywhere. We've long looked for practical solutions for our educational policies. How do you teach languages? Which languages? And as from the point we carried out research on our own environment, we were able to draw some ideas that guided us within our context. For instance, we long thought that the knowledge of Luxembourgish was essential to learn how to read and write in German. And research was then carried out over the past few years by our experts in Luxembourg, who took into consideration the specific environment, and they have enlightened us on a certain number of things, and they've given us the evidence to be able to build our new policies. Thank you.
And Mr. Murray, we'll turn to you next for some advice on promoting multilingualism in all forms of language.
Thank you. I think there's one clear thing to these challenges that we face, is this language environment. We need to share with you a situation of Australia where 40 deaf children who had been given cochlear implants, who grew up in an elementary school receiving their education, and their parents were told, do not sign with your children. So they grew up with minimal access to a spoken language through their cochlear implant. And the hospital then contacted every patient subsequently that said, I'm sorry, we've messed up the technology. These implants aren't going to be of any use to your child. Can you imagine? These children grew up with no functional language access at all because they were told not to sign as parents with their children. So can you imagine, in terms of this language environment, this deprivation, choosing one language over others? We have to oppose that. We have to combat that. And we will have a recommendation to recognize and cherish the languages of every child. And children can learn different languages. They have a unique ability to adjust and calibrate to the people that they meet, and they use different languages. It's a beautiful, beautiful experience. This human capacity to recognize and promote our inner human blessings to access many languages. And we have, as I said, over 200 different sign languages across the world, and they can access that. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we'll turn to Ms. Fall.
Merci.
Thank you. Well, when it comes to recommendations, I would speak to the states mainly because these are our contacts, the people we work with, the ministries of education. And my first recommendation would be to really implement the political commitment that we have seen in a variety of contexts, a political commitment towards national languages and bilingualism, but to implement that more concretely in the framework of a systemic reform, to go beyond simple experimentation and to go to a full-fledged reform. And this reform also requires financial engagement. The national budget must provide for that reform. And this is how we can go beyond the pilot projects and really move towards a national reform. My second recommendation would be to adopt explicitly bilingual language educational policies that would integrate the national languages as a teaching language. This is fundamental for any bilingual reform. And these are the two recommendations that I would really make. I'd also like to add as we've heard a moment ago, the issue of bilingualism and taking into consideration national languages isn't just a matter of a one-size-fits-all. It shows added value in a variety of social linguistic contexts, in a variety of political contexts. But the added value for the learning of children is real. It has been demonstrated by all the surveys and assessments that have been carried out. So the time has now come to translate that politically into regulations and into reform.
And finally, Mr. Connolly, if you might have some words.
And the first one would be around changes in perceptions around multilingualism, which is often seen as a problem to be solved within education as opposed to an asset to teaching and learning. And I think those changes in perceptions are possible. I've seen it myself. I think within the British Council, in my career, I started off as an English teacher in a monolingual native speaker type model, which I accepted as the reality 25 years ago. That is now completely transformed. And so that transformation is possible within organizations, countries, and people's perceptions. I'd also say it's very important that we make the economic case for multilingualism. Investment is needed for good multilingual education systems and professional development and in curricula and resources and so on. We need to show the return on that investment. What does it mean for well-being and employment and economic advancement for individuals and for societies? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Conley, sorry. All right, that ends my questions for the panel, and now we turn it over to the audience. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, if there are any questions coming from the audience. Yes, sir. Yes, and yeah, you can use the mic at the table. If you push the button, I think we'll be able to hear you.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Shannon, and all the speakers. My name is Muhammad Ali Khan, and I'm a Fulbright scholar in Baji Mukhtar and Naba. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that when we talk of multilingualism, we tend to focus more on early childhood education, and it makes sense, sure, and secondary. But when it comes to higher education, I see a transition from multilingualism to monolingualism, and we don't have university programs that offer multilingual option to degree programs. The case in point in Baji Mukhtar University, where I'm working, so the state of Algeria has decided EMI, English Medium of Instruction in Higher Education. It was a very top-down decision, as most of these decisions are. And now it's left on teachers who are not prepared to teach an English medium higher education course. So here, one ideology, a country which is hugely multilingualism, but the institution has put down this huge burden on teachers to teach an EMI course. So when I'm working there and I'm with these teachers, so what I see is, because of this policy, there is hardly any communication in the classroom. So the teachers are not prepared in higher education, and there is this mad rush of English medium instruction only, because multilingual discourses are not projecting, as you said, the economic case of multilingualism. The point I'm making is there is a huge need of work in higher education, because in higher education, people understand that it's going to be only monolingual. Let transit people from multilingualism to monolingualism. This is my question, and if you have any comment, this is my comment. If you want to say something, please.
Thank you. Michael?
I can come in with that. Thank you, Mohammed. And I have to say, I totally agree. I mentioned at the beginning, in our research, we've described the growth of English medium and higher education as a runaway train. It is every country and every institution around the world. And as I mentioned, it's connected to ideas around internationalization. And also, there's an economic thing. Internationalization equals foreign students, equals income for universities and so on. But compared to basic education, the research into this is minimal. And I think it's unquestioned by countries, by individual institutions. They aren't considering the pedagogical implications. They aren't considering the impact on the students, on learning. Are they actually learning English? Probably not. Are they actually learning the subject they were meant to be learning in the first place? Probably not as well. So I think that it's a massive challenge, and I know when I've been at higher education forums in the past, it's rarely discussed. It's seen as a kind of an uncomfortable area to discuss because of the economics behind it. So I don't necessarily have a solution, just to say that I agree with your concerns about this, and I think the implications of the growth over the last 20 years, it's hard to know what they are. There's kind of no research into it. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else, please?
Merci. Et merci pour...
Thank you, and thank you very much for the question, whether it's a question or a statement. Simply to give you our experience in Francophonie and elsewhere, and you are quite right, we do concentrate on preschool and primary school. And then, at a later stage, we somehow assume that national languages lose in importance or even are simply vanish from the system. They are subtracted from the system as though they were just a stepping stone for an international language, whether that be English or French. But I think it's a matter of political choices. What type of multilingualism are we aiming for? Do we want the national language, the spoken language, to truly play its role throughout life, not only at university, but lifelong? And just to give an example, we know that in Nigeria, for instance, it is possible to continue your university studies in the national language. People have a thesis in Yoruba, for instance, and some countries have made that choice. It is true that we don't have much research on that level of education, but I think that we need to capitalize on what we have and then share it.
Mr. Murray, did you want to add anything?
Thank you for that question. I happen to work in a bilingual university, Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and it's fully bilingual. We have American Sign Language and English. And for this to work, the university has to invest in bilingualism. You must be willing to support your professors, support your funders, support your learners, to make sure that you actually have an academic environment that functions in these languages. And I think at Gallaudet University, we have a bilingual officer who reports straight to the president of the university, and that person is responsible to monitor and finance to make sure that their progress is matching in both those languages. And as professors, we are obligated to assess our students in both of those languages. And we have to become fully bilingual in 2008. And the requirement requires a lot of investment, a lot of capacity to continue at that level. But behind that, I believe that we actually have our students graduate as fully competent academic teachers and lecturers. And it can be done, but it needs commitment from the university directors to make it happen.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. And I think Ms. Sevnik has something to say as well. It's a wonderful question. It's great.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Do allow me to get back to primary school and early childhood, but I I was trying to explain the difficulties that pupils encounter in our own system. But of course, it also applies to teachers who are also teaching in a language that is not their first language. So with the project that I presented on French literacy, this will also require from teachers to reorganize and relearn how to teach children to read and write in a language other than the one that they themselves learned. So as Madam was saying a moment ago, this requires a gigantic effort on behalf of the government to prepare them, to offer the teacher training, the ongoing training, to ensure that the change can happen. And when the reform is generalized, which will be in 2026, it's going to need a massive effort for information, training, and all of the changes that this actually involves. So it's a big effort for the teachers. So maybe I hadn't said this enough in my presentation.
So I would like to wrap up as we're out of time. And I want to thank our panelists. And we've covered quite a bit of ground here today. We've talked about attitudes, trends, social and cultural context and implications for multilingualisms. Talked about the politics of multilingualism, education, the rights, the opportunities and the inequalities, and many of the challenges. And I encourage all of you to leave today thinking about identity and multilingualism. What does it mean to be multilingual and to have multiple identities? And what role does that play in all of these issues? So I'd like to thank our panel, Ms. Sevnik, Mr. Murray, Ms. Fall, and Mr. Connolly for their time. And thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.